My wife divorced me the day I buried my dad, then brought her new boyfriend into our home and demanded half of my inheritance. The manila envelope hit our kitchen table with a sound that changed everything. Heather slid it toward me like she was dealing a final hand of cards, her new boyfriend Derek nodding beside her while some lawyer in a cheap suit shuffled papers. I stood there holding my dad's photo albums, still wearing the black suit from his funeral that morning. The kitchen smelled like the casserole our neighbor had brought over, food for grieving that would go cold and untouched. These are divorce papers. I've already filed them with the court. Heather's voice was flat, businesslike, like she was returning a defective appliance. No condolences, no acknowledgement that I'd just buried the man who raised me alone after my mom died when I was 12. You're serving me divorce papers on the day I get back from my father's funeral. I couldn't wait any longer. Your grief is too much drama for everyone involved. She gestured toward Derek like they were a team. I need to move on with my life. The lawyer started explaining community property laws and asset division procedures. Heather interrupted her to mention that she'd be seeking half of my inheritance from my dad, since we were still legally married when he passed away. It's only fair. I supported you through his illness. I deserve to be compensated for what I contributed to this relationship. I stared at this woman I'd shared a bed with for 7 years, who I trusted with my deepest fears about losing my dad. She was sitting in our kitchen with another man, talking about my father's death like it was a business opportunity. That's when I realized I'd never actually known her at all. The lawyer handed me a card and suggested I contact my own attorney within the next few days. Derek, this stranger sitting at my kitchen table, advised that if I wanted to make this process easier on everyone, I should consider agreeing to Heather's terms rather than fighting them in court. They left me sitting alone with divorce papers and the sound of my dad's voice in my head, asking me to take care of Heather and give her his love. The next morning I woke up in our guest bedroom, since Heather had apparently moved back into our house while I was at the funeral. She was making coffee in the kitchen like nothing had happened, humming some tune I didn't recognize. We need to talk about logistics, she said without looking at me. Derek thinks it would be better if you stayed somewhere else while we sort out the legal details. Derek thinks? I poured myself coffee from the pot she'd made. This is my house too. Actually, it's going to be complicated. My lawyer says the mortgage payments might factor into the asset division, especially with the inheritance money coming in. She had it all figured out. The timeline, the legal strategy, the financial calculations. While I'd been sitting vigil in a hospital room, she'd been planning how to maximize her profit from my dad's death. I grabbed my laptop and drove to a coffee shop across town, needing space to think and make phone calls without her listening to every word. I called my brother-in-law Justin, married to my dad's younger sister. She what? Justin's voice cracked through the phone. Jesus, she served you papers at the funeral? The day I got back, she was sitting in our kitchen with her lawyer and some guy named Derek. Derek who? How long has this been going on? That's when Justin told me something that made my stomach drop. Heather had called him 3 weeks before my dad died, asking casual questions about inheritance laws and whether assets received during marriage were considered community property. She'd been researching her exit strategy while my dad was dying in hospice care, which is how I ended up sitting in that coffee shop parking lot with a dead phone and a shaking hand, realizing my wife had been planning to rob me blind since before my father was even buried. Here's what that day was supposed to look like. I was supposed to drive home from the small mountain town where my dad had lived his entire life. Population maybe 3,000. I was supposed to have a quiet evening with my wife, maybe look through the photo albums together, share stories about the man who'd walked her down the aisle at our wedding because her own father had passed years earlier. My dad had been battling pancreatic cancer for 2 years. I'd been making the drive every other weekend to help him with doctor appointments, yard work, and just spend time together while we still could. The thing I should have paid attention to was her phone buzzing constantly during his last few weeks, messages she'd quickly silence or take to another room to answer. At first I figured she was dealing with work stress or coordinating with friends about emotional support during this difficult time. Looking back though, those text alerts had a different rhythm than work messages or casual conversations. They came at odd hours. They made her smile in ways that seemed disconnected from our situation. They pulled her attention away during conversations about funeral planning and estate details. But I was too focused on my dad to analyze Heather's texting patterns. Heather started going out more often with friends I'd never met around 6 months before my dad passed away. She'd come home late from mysterious events that never seemed to have concrete details. How was Jennifer's birthday party? I'd ask. Fine, just dinner and drinks. What restaurant? I don't remember the name. Someplace downtown. She'd been social during our 7 years of marriage, but this was different. Vague explanations, defensive reactions to basic questions, a sense that she was participating in a life I wasn't part of. Small amounts of money started disappearing from our joint savings account too. $50 here, $100 there, withdrawn at ATMs I didn't recognize in parts of town where neither of us worked or had friends. When I asked about it, she said she'd been getting cash for tips at the new salon she'd started going to, but the amounts didn't match her explanation, and the timing seemed random rather than monthly appointments. Heather also developed a sudden interest in my dad's health updates and financial situation. She'd ask detailed questions about his medical expenses, his insurance coverage, whether he'd updated his will recently. I'm just worried about how this is affecting our budget, she'd say when I commented on her curiosity. All these trips are adding up. Her questions felt more like intelligence gathering than genuine concern about our finances. She'd come home from these mysterious outings smelling like expensive men's cologne that wasn't mine too. When I mentioned it, she claimed she'd hugged some friend's boyfriend or been in a crowded bar where someone had been wearing too much fragrance. When I suggested she come to one of my dad's doctor appointments, she became irritated, almost angry. She insisted that medical appointments were private and that my dad probably didn't want her there anyway. You're being weird about this, she said. Like you want me to be more involved, but then you act like I'm intruding when I ask questions. I started paying closer attention after that conversation, but by then, my dad's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was spending most of my mental energy on medical decisions and end-of-life planning. The discovery that I couldn't ignore happened 2 weeks before my dad died. I was looking for our insurance paperwork in Heather's car when something caught my eye. A receipt from a restaurant I'd never heard of tucked between the seats, dated on a night when she'd said she was working late. My hand started shaking as I read the details. 2 dinners and a bottle of of wine that cost more than we usually spend on dinner for a week, time-stamped at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 hours after she texted me saying she was staying at the office to finish a project. I confronted her that evening, showing her the receipt and asking for an explanation. I was at a work dinner, client entertainment, the company reimbursed me. Which client? I can't discuss client details with you, you know that. Then show me the reimbursement. I don't have to show you anything. This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior that's been driving me crazy. She turned my discovery into an accusation against me, somehow making my reasonable questions seem unreasonable. Maybe I was overreacting. Everyone said it wasn't a big deal. My friend Greg told me that marriages go through rough patches during major stress, that Heather was probably just processing the situation differently than I was. My sister-in-law suggested that some people deal with impending death by creating distance, protecting themselves from the emotional impact. Even my dad's neighbor, Mrs. Mitchell, said that Heather was probably just scared about losing another father figure, since her own dad had died young. People handle grief in strange ways, she told me. Some folks run toward it, some run away from it. Don't take it personal. I almost convinced myself they were right. Maybe Heather's distance was her way of protecting both of us from the pain of losing my dad. Maybe her secretive behavior was just her way of maintaining some normalcy during an abnormal time. Maybe I was being paranoid and controlling, like she'd accused me of being, until I found the dating app notification on her phone. Heather had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. It buzzed with a notification from an app I didn't recognize. When I glanced at the screen, I saw a message preview that made my blood freeze. Derek, can't wait to see you tonight. Same place as last week? I stared at that notification until the screen went dark, trying to convince myself there was some innocent explanation. Maybe Derek was a coworker. Maybe it was about a group event. Maybe I was misunderstanding the context. But I wasn't misunderstanding anything. When Heather came out of the bathroom, I handed her the phone without saying anything. She looked at the screen, saw that the notification had been viewed, and immediately went on the attack. You were going through my phone? It was sitting right there, the notification popped up. That's an invasion of privacy. I can't believe you'd violate my trust like that. Who's Derek? He's a friend from work. We're planning a surprise party for someone in my department. What kind of surprise party requires meeting at the same place as last week? I don't have to explain every detail of my social life to you. This paranoid jealousy is exactly why I need space to figure out what I want. Again, she'd flipped my legitimate concern into evidence of my character flaws, but this time I didn't back down. I waited until she left for one of her mysterious evening events. Then I did something I'd never done in 7 years of marriage. I logged into our cellular account online. What I found made me physically sick. Months of text messages and phone calls with Derek's number, starting in March and increasing in frequency through the summer. Hundreds of messages, some sent at midnight or later, others during work hours when she should have been focused on her job. I printed out 3 months of phone records and highlighted every interaction with Derek's number. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't casual friendship or work collaboration. This was constant communication with someone who had become central to her daily life. The records also showed something that broke what was left of my heart. She'd been texting and calling Derek during my dad's final weeks, including the day he was admitted to hospice care and the night he died. While I was holding my father's hand as he took his last breath, she was sending messages to another man. I photographed the dating app notification before it could disappear, made copies of the phone records and stored them in a safe deposit box at our bank, started keeping a journal of her comings and goings, noting discrepancies between her stated plans and her actual behavior. But I needed more than phone records to prove what was really happening. The next test came when I called her office pretending to be a delivery driver with a package for her. The receptionist told me that Heather had left early that day for a dentist appointment, but Heather had texted me that she was working late and wouldn't be home until after 9. I drove to her office parking lot and confirmed that her car wasn't there. Then I drove to the restaurant where I'd found that expensive dinner receipt. When I pulled into the parking lot, my stomach dropped. Her car was parked right out front. Through the window, I saw her laughing over wine with a man I didn't recognize. Derek, presumably, while I thought she was stuck at work dealing with deadlines. I took photos of her car in the parking lot, time-stamped against her text message claiming she was working late. I also saved screenshots of the restaurant's location and hours, creating a paper trail that would prove her deception. But I needed something more concrete, something that would prove intent rather than just opportunity. I started checking our joint credit card statements more carefully, looking for charges that didn't match Heather's stated activities or locations. What I found made me want to vomit. Charges at hotels during times when Heather had claimed to be visiting her sister across town. Restaurant bills for expensive dinners on nights when she'd said she was working late or attending work events. Even charges at a jewelry store for an item I'd never seen her wear. She'd been funding her affair with our money, using our joint accounts to pay for her betrayal of our marriage. Every romantic dinner with Derek, every hotel room where they'd carried on their relationship, every gift he'd bought her, all of it paid for with money I'd earned working overtime to cover my dad's medical expenses and travel costs. I made copies of 6 months of credit card statements, highlighting every charge that corresponded with her lies about her whereabouts. Started taking photos of her jewelry and accessories, noting when new items appeared that I hadn't seen her purchase. The evidence was building, but I needed professional documentation if this was going to end up in divorce court. I hired a private investigator named Patricia who specialized in infidelity cases. I couldn't stomach following Heather around myself, but I needed someone who could document her activities legally and thoroughly. What Patricia discovered over 3 weeks made the phone records and credit card statements look like minor infractions. Hotel check-ins during lunch hours when Heather claimed to be at work meetings, long dinners with Derek at expensive restaurants when she claimed to be grocery shopping or running errands, photos of Heather entering and leaving Derek's apartment complex during times when she claimed to be staying with her sister. But the most damaging discovery was this. Patricia had documented Heather meeting with a divorce attorney 6 weeks before my dad died. Photos of her entering and leaving a law office, time-stamped and geotagged, proving that she'd been planning her exit strategy while I was focused on my father's declining health. The investigator's report included witness statements from restaurant staff who recognized Heather and Derek as regular customers, hotel records showing multiple bookings under Derek's name with Heather listed as his companion, even parking tickets that placed Heather's car at Derek's apartment complex during times when she claimed to be elsewhere. Patricia's report painted a complete picture of systematic deception spanning 8 months. Heather hadn't just been having an affair, she'd been living a completely separate life, funded by our joint finances, while I was spending my savings and vacation time caring for my dying father. And that's when I realized she wasn't just betraying me, she was trying to erase my dad's memory too. That's when the blowback started. Heather's behavior toward me grew increasingly hostile as I asked more questions and paid closer attention to her comings and goings. She started accusing me of being obsessive manipulative and controlling, claiming that my suspicions were evidence of my deteriorating mental state. "You're becoming paranoid," she told me one evening when I asked why she'd come home 3 hours later than expected. "This obsession with tracking my every move is unhealthy. Maybe you should talk to someone about your grief issues." She began making comments to mutual friends about my erratic behavior and unhealthy obsession with her activities. Friends started calling to check on me, expressing concern about how I was handling my dad's illness and the stress it was putting on my marriage. Heather also started working longer hours, or claiming to, staying at the office until 8 or 9 most nights, and leaving early on weekend mornings for work projects that never seemed to have clear objectives or endpoints. She was systematically reducing the amount of time we spent together, making it harder for me to track her actual activities. Her physical behavior toward me changed too. No more casual touches, goodbye kisses, or shared meals. She moved through our house like I was a roommate she barely tolerated rather than her husband of 7 years. Our bedroom became a cold, silent space where we slept on opposite sides of the bed without speaking. Most cruelly, she started using my dad's condition as a weapon against me. She'd make comments about how my obsession with his medical care was affecting my judgment, how my frequent trips to visit him were unhealthy, how my grief was making me impossible to live with. "You care more about a dying man than your living wife," she said during one particularly vicious argument. "It's like you want him to die so you can play the grieving son and get sympathy from everyone." She was rewriting the narrative of our relationship, positioning herself as the victim of my emotional instability rather than the perpetrator of systematic deception and betrayal. 2 weeks before my dad died, Heather announced that she needed space to figure out what she wanted from our marriage. She said she was going to stay with her sister across town for a few weeks while she decided whether our relationship was worth saving. "I can't handle being around all this negative energy," she explained while packing a suitcase. "Your grief is affecting my mental health, and I need to take care of myself." I was devastated but tried to be understanding, still believing at that point that our problems were related to the stress of my dad's illness rather than her calculated betrayal. "Take all the time you need," I told her. "I love you and I want us to work through this." She just nodded and said she'd call me in a few days, but she didn't call. Instead, she used her absence from our house to spend more time with Derek while maintaining the fiction that she was at her sister's place processing her feelings about our marriage. When my dad took his final turn for the worse, I called Heather from the hospital parking lot. I needed her support more than I'd ever needed anything in my life. I left a voicemail explaining that my dad was dying and that I didn't want to face this alone. She texted me back 6 hours later saying she was sorry to hear about my dad's condition, but that she couldn't handle being around all that emotional intensity right now. She said she'd call me after everything was over. I read that text message while sitting in a hospital chair next to my unconscious father. I felt something break inside me that I didn't know could break. My dad passed away on a Friday morning at 6:23 a.m. I was holding his hand, alone in a sterile hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and dying flowers from previous visitors. The last thing he said to me, 2 days earlier when he was still lucid, was to make sure I took care of Heather and give her his love. All I wanted was to grieve my father's death in peace and maybe salvage whatever was left of my marriage. Somehow it turned into a fight for my financial survival and my sanity. The funeral planning, the arrangements, the endless paperwork that comes with death. I handled all of it by myself. Choosing a casket, writing an obituary, coordinating with a church where my dad had been a member for 40 years. Heather sent a text saying she was sorry for my loss and that she'd see me when I got home. My dad's best friend Bill helped me carry the casket. My high school baseball coach gave one of the eulogies. Neighbors who remembered my dad coaching youth league and volunteering at the fire department filled the small church to capacity. Heather wasn't there. When I returned from the funeral, I found Heather sitting in our kitchen with Derek and her lawyer, ready to serve divorce papers and demand half of everything my dad had left me. But I wasn't the same person who'd driven away to bury his father that morning. Sitting in that hospital room for 3 days, watching my dad die while my wife refused to support me, had clarified something fundamental about who she really was. When Heather slid those divorce papers across the table and started talking about asset division and community property, I didn't react with shock or hurt or desperate attempts to negotiate. I looked at her calmly and said, "I'll need to review these documents with my attorney." "Your attorney?" She seemed surprised that I wasn't falling apart or begging her to reconsider. "Yes, I assume you'll want this process to be thorough and fair. That means we'll both need proper legal representation to ensure everything is handled correctly." I could see confusion in Derek's eyes, like he'd expected me to be more emotional or desperate. Heather's lawyer looked slightly uncomfortable, probably anticipating a more dramatic scene that would position Heather as the reasonable party dealing with an unstable spouse. Instead, I gathered up the photo albums I'd brought home from my dad's house, thanked them for their time, and walked upstairs to pack a bag. I'd already decided I wasn't going to fight this battle from a position of weakness or surprise. That afternoon, I met with Jennifer Hayes, a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving complex asset division and allegations of misconduct. I brought copies of everything: the phone records, credit card statements, private investigator's report, photos of Heather's car at the restaurant, documentation of her lies about work schedules. "Your wife's timing isn't coincidental," Jennifer told me during our first meeting. "This is a calculated strategy. People often file for divorce immediately after a spouse receives an inheritance, hoping to claim it before legal protections can be established." She explained that inheritance is typically considered separate property in our state, but that Heather's legal team would try to argue that marital funds had been used for expenses related to my dad's care, or that I'd somehow mixed the inherited assets with our joint accounts. "However," she continued, examining the evidence I'd brought, "this documentation shows a pattern of deception and financial misconduct that could completely change how a judge views her claims. The credit card fraud alone might be grounds for criminal charges." Jennifer filed our response, arguing that inheritance is separate property under state law and that Heather's claims had no legal merit. We also requested full financial disclosure from both Heather and Derek, since their relationship had begun during our marriage and might involve assets that belonged to me. We included Patricia's report as evidence that Heather had been planning the divorce while actively deceiving me about her activities. We filed a counterclaim seeking restitution for all the money she'd stolen from our accounts and demanding that she be held responsible for any debts she'd accumulated in my name. Heather's response was swift and vicious. Her legal team filed a restraining order against me, claiming that my investigation into our finances constituted harassment, that I'd been stalking her by driving past places where she worked or spent time. The restraining order was clearly tactical, designed to make me look unstable and potentially dangerous in front of a family court judge, but it also meant that I couldn't go to half the places in our town without worrying about accidentally violating a court order. I had to find a new grocery store, a new gas gas station, a new route to work. Simple errands became complicated calculations about whether I might accidentally end up somewhere that Heather could claim I was violating the order. The psychological effect was brutal. I felt like I was being punished for grieving. Like my sadness about losing my dad was being used as evidence that I was somehow dangerous or unbalanced. Heather also started spreading stories around town about how I'd become obsessed with her new relationship, how I was trying to destroy her life out of spite. People who didn't know the full situation began treating me differently, like I was the bitter ex-husband who couldn't let go. The social isolation was almost worse than the legal battle. I'd lost my father, my wife, and now my reputation in the community where we lived together. Every trip to the bank or the post office meant potentially running into someone who'd heard Heather's version of events. My work started suffering too. It was hard to focus on construction schedules and budget meetings when I was spending my lunch breaks on the phone with lawyers, and my evenings reviewing legal documents. My boss was understanding about the divorce, but less patient with my distraction and declining performance. 6 months into the legal process, the stakes escalated beyond just money and reputation. Heather's legal team filed motions claiming that my harassment and stalking behavior made me unfit to manage my father's estate. They argued that someone who would abuse the legal system to attack his ex-wife shouldn't be trusted with significant financial assets. If successful, this motion would have transferred control of my inheritance to a court-appointed trustee, effectively stealing my father's legacy through legal maneuvering. I made the decision to take a leave of absence from work and focus entirely on the case. I used some of my dad's life insurance money to cover my expenses and legal fees. It felt like I was dishonoring his memory, but it seemed like the only way to protect what he'd left me. The leave of absence also gave me time to focus completely on building our case. I spent weeks organizing documents, creating timelines, and working with Jennifer to prepare for depositions and court hearings. What we discovered during the discovery process shocked even Jennifer. Heather's bank records revealed that she'd been transferring money from our joint savings account to a personal account I didn't know existed. Small amounts at first, $50 or $100 at a time, but it had been going on for almost a year. She'd stolen nearly $4,000 from our shared finances while planning to leave me. Credit reports showed that she'd opened a credit card in my name without my knowledge, used it to buy gifts for Derek, expensive dinners, weekend hotel stays, even jewelry. She'd been funding her affair with my money and my credit, accumulating debt that I would be responsible for if we didn't fight it in court. Derek's financial records showed that he'd been paying for expensive vacations and gifts for Heather, including a weekend trip to wine country that had happened while my dad was in hospice care. She told me she was visiting her college roommate that weekend. But the most devastating discovery came when we found emails between Heather and her sister discussing her plans to leave me. Messages dated from more than 2 years earlier, long before my dad's diagnosis. Messages showing her complaining about our marriage and researching divorce lawyers. Her entire story about needing space to figure things out was a lie. About my grief being too much for her to handle. About not being able to support me through my dad's illness. All of it was fiction designed to position herself for a better divorce settlement. She hadn't left me because I was grieving. She'd been planning to leave me for years and had simply waited for the most advantageous moment to execute her plan. The text message evidence was even worse. Detailed conversations between Heather and Derek about waiting for the right time to file for divorce. Discussions about my dad's health and how his death might affect their timeline for going public with their relationship. In one message from 2 weeks before my dad passed, she'd written to Derek, "Once the old man dies, I'll have leverage to get a better settlement. Just need to wait for the money to clear." My dad wasn't even a name to her. He was the old man whose death represented a financial opportunity. We also discovered that Heather had been researching my father's assets and health condition online, using public records and social media to track his medical appointments and financial situation. She'd been planning her divorce strategy based on information about my dad's condition that I'd shared with her in confidence. Most disturbing of all, we found evidence that she'd hired her own private investigator to follow me, to gather information about my visits to my father. The investigator's report included detailed notes about my dad's house, his car, his daily routines, and his apparent health status. Heather hadn't just been planning to leave me. She'd been conducting surveillance on my dying father to better position herself for a divorce settlement. After that, everything shifted. During my deposition, Heather's lawyer spent 4 hours questioning me about every conversation I'd had with my dad about money, every dollar I'd spent visiting him, every decision I'd made about his medical care. They were trying to build a case that I'd somehow influenced him to leave me everything, that my inheritance was the result of manipulation rather than a father's love. "Did you ever discuss your wife's financial needs with your father?" "Of course, he cared about our future together." "Did you tell him that Heather would benefit from any inheritance you received?" "He knew we were married. He assumed we'd share whatever he left me." "So you did discuss the inheritance with him?" "I discussed our plans for the future, yes." "Did you encourage him to leave you more money than he might have otherwise?" Sitting in that conference room, answering invasive questions about the most painful period of my life, while Heather sat across from me taking notes with her lawyer, I realized what was really happening. She wasn't just trying to take my money. She was trying to destroy my memory of my relationship with my dad. Every question was designed to suggest that I'd been manipulating a dying man for financial gain, that my grief was somehow calculated, that my love for my father had been contaminated by greed. That's when something fundamental shifted in me. I stopped being hurt and started being angry. After the deposition, I told Jennifer to stop trying to negotiate a settlement and start fighting back as aggressively as possible. "I want to expose everything," I told her. "Every lie, every theft, every manipulation. I don't care what it costs." Jennifer smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Now we're talking." We filed counter motions requesting Heather's complete financial records going back 5 years, including her income, expenses, and any gifts or support she'd received from Derek or anyone else during their affair. We subpoenaed her employer's records to verify her claimed work schedule during the times she'd said she was at work events. We also filed for sanctions against Heather's legal team for the frivolous harassment claims, for attempting to use false allegations to gain advantage in the divorce proceedings. If she wanted to make this about money and dishonesty, we were going to expose exactly how dishonest she'd been about money. The counter-discovery process took 3 months and revealed a level of deception that shocked even Jennifer. Heather's employer confirmed that there had been no work events on most of the nights she'd claimed to be out for professional reasons. She'd been lying about her whereabouts for almost a year. We found evidence that Heather and Derek had been living together in his apartment for months, while she maintained the fiction of staying with her sister. Utility bills and lease agreements showed that she'd been listed as a resident at his address since 2 months before my dad died. Bank records revealed that Derek had been supporting Heather financially throughout their relationship, paying her car insurance, cell phone bills, and even contributing to her personal spending money. She'd been essentially married to him while still legally married to me, using his financial support to maintain her lifestyle while planning to take half of my inheritance. But the most damaging discovery was this. Heather had been in contact with multiple divorce attorneys over a period of 18 months, shopping around for the best strategy to maximize her settlement. Email correspondence showed detailed discussions about timing, asset protection, and strategies for portraying me as an unfit or unstable spouse. One attorney had advised her to document any instances of controlling behavior or emotional instability on my part, leading to her pattern of provoking arguments and then claiming I was becoming increasingly difficult to live with. Another attorney had suggested that she establish a pattern of being the primary income earner or household manager, which explained her sudden interest in taking over our finances and her claims that she'd been supporting me through my dad's illness. The final confrontation came during a settlement conference that the court had ordered before scheduling a trial. Heather, Derek, and her legal team sat on one side of a conference table, while Jennifer and I sat on the other. A mediator attempted to negotiate a resolution. Heather's lawyer opened by reiterating their position that she deserved half of my inheritance plus alimony and a portion of our joint assets. They claimed that her affair was irrelevant to the financial aspects of the divorce and that her planning ahead showed practical thinking rather than malicious intent. I looked directly at Heather for the first time in months. I'd like to know exactly what support you provided during my father's illness. I maintained our household while you were absent. I managed our finances and provided emotional stability during a difficult period. I slid a copy of her credit card statements across the table, highlighted the charges for hotels and restaurants during the weeks leading up to my dad's death. These are charges for hotel rooms and romantic dinners with Derek while I was in the hospital with my dying father. Can you explain how that constituted providing me with emotional stability? Her lawyer tried to object to my direct questioning, but the mediator allowed Heather to respond. I needed support too. You weren't available to meet my emotional needs. I placed a copy of the text message where she'd referred to my dad as the old man, whose death would give her leverage for a better settlement. And this message to Derek, where you discussed waiting for my father to die so you could get more money, was that also about meeting your emotional needs? Heather's face went white. Her lawyer hadn't seen that particular piece of evidence. It was clear from his expression that it changed his assessment of their legal position. The mediator reviewed the documents I'd presented, along with the private investigator's report, the evidence of credit card fraud, and the proof that Heather had been living with Derek while claiming to need space to work on our marriage. Mrs. Heather, he said finally, given the evidence of misconduct and deception presented here, I have to advise you that pursuing your current claims could result in significant financial consequences for you, including potential criminal charges and liability for attorney fees. The room fell silent. Derek, who had been nodding supportively throughout Heather's lawyer's opening statement, suddenly looked uncomfortable and distant. Heather's lawyer asked for a brief recess to discuss options with his client. When they returned 20 minutes later, their position had completely changed. We're prepared to offer a settlement, her lawyer announced. Ms. Heather will relinquish all claims to the inheritance and joint assets, take responsibility for the debts accumulated in Mr. Name's name, and pay restitution for funds inappropriately taken from joint accounts. Jennifer and I had discussed this possibility, but I hadn't expected such a complete capitulation. I looked at Heather, who was staring at her hands and refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Additionally, her lawyer continued, Ms. Heather will agree to a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting Mr. In name or interfering with his management of the inherited property. The mediator asked if I found these terms acceptable. I thought about my dad, about his letter asking me to take care of Heather and give her his love. I thought about the man who'd raised me to be fair and compassionate, even to people who didn't deserve it. Then I thought about Heather calling him the old man and planning to profit from his death. Any remaining sympathy disappeared completely. I accept those terms with one addition. I want a written admission that her claims about my behavior during the marriage were false, and that her allegations of harassment were made for strategic purposes rather than legitimate safety concerns. Heather's lawyer started to object, but Heather herself cut him off. Fine, I'll sign whatever you want. I just want this to be over. It didn't look like TV justice, but after 14 months of legal warfare, I finally had a resolution that felt fair. More than fair. It felt like vindication. Heather received no assets from our marriage, was ordered to pay back all the money she'd stolen plus interest, was required to cover my attorney fees. The credit card debt she'd accumulated in my name was transferred entirely to her responsibility. She was also ordered to stay away from me, my family, and my father's property for 5 years, which meant she couldn't attempt to contact me or interfere with my life in any way. Heather was ordered to pay me almost $60,000 in restitution and fees. She'd spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to steal my inheritance, and ended up worse off than if she'd simply filed for a straightforward no-fault divorce. Most importantly, my dad's final gift to me was completely protected. The house where I'd grown up, the savings he'd accumulated through decades of hard work, the life insurance policy he'd maintained so that I'd have security, all of it remained exactly where he'd intended it to go. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was emotional. Fighting back against Heather's manipulations had forced me to stop being a victim of her betrayal and start being an active participant in my own recovery. Instead of just absorbing her attacks, I'd learned to defend myself in the memory of my relationship with my dad. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I made the decision to move back to my hometown and live in my dad's house. The suburban life that Heather and I had built together felt hollow now that I understood how little of it had been real. My dad's house needed significant work. New roof, updated plumbing, fresh paint throughout, but it felt like home in a way that nowhere else had since he'd died. I could walk through rooms full of memories of him, tend the garden he loved, sit on the porch where we'd had our last real conversation before he got too sick to talk much. I quit my project management job and started a small construction business, using skills my dad had taught me and connections I'd made over the years. Working with my hands, building things that would last, felt more meaningful than managing other people's projects for a corporate salary. Living in my hometown also meant I was closer to the friends and extended family who'd known my dad, who could share stories about him that helped keep his memory alive in ways that went beyond just missing him. Bill, my dad's best friend, became a regular dinner companion. He'd bring over groceries and we'd cook together, sharing stories about my dad's younger days that I'd never heard. Mrs. Mitchell would stop by with baked goods and updates on neighborhood gossip that my dad would have found amusing. I also started attending grief counseling, something I probably should have done immediately after my dad died but had been too distracted by the divorce to pursue. The therapist helped me separate my grief about losing my father from my anger about Heather's betrayal. They'd become tangled together in ways that made both harder to process. Grief and betrayal are different kinds of pain, she told me, but when they happen simultaneously, people often try to to resolve them both the same way. You can't fight your way through grief the way you fought through your divorce. Learning to grieve properly, without the complication of legal battles and financial stress, helped me understand how much my dad's death had actually affected me. The sadness I'd been avoiding while fighting Heather finally had space to exist without being weaponized against me. 8 months after moving back home, I met Lisa at a grief support group in the next town over. She'd lost her mother 2 years earlier to breast cancer and understood the complicated emotions that come with losing a parent to a long illness. She also understood why trust didn't come easily for me anymore. Her own divorce, finalized just before her mother's death, had taught her about people who see crisis as opportunity. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honesty about our respective damage and shared experience with loss. We'd meet for coffee after support group meetings, take long walks where we could talk without the pressure of romantic expectations. Gradually, we discovered that we enjoyed each other's company beyond just shared trauma. She never pressured me to get over what Heather had done or to move faster than felt comfortable. She'd been through her own version of betrayal during grief and knew that healing happens on its own timeline. The hardest part, she told me one evening as we sat on my dad's porch watching the sunset, was learning that some people's sympathy is really just curiosity. They want to hear about your pain, but they don't want to help you carry it. How do you tell the difference? The people who really care about you ask how you're doing today, not what happened back then. They're more interested in your recovery than in your story. Lisa asked about my recovery. She wanted to know what helped me sleep better, what made me laugh, what I was looking forward to. She treated my healing like something that mattered more than my history. 1 year after we met, I asked her to move in with me, not because I was lonely or trying to replace what I'd lost with Heather, but because I'd rediscovered what it felt like to be with someone who actually liked me as a person. We spent months planning how to blend our lives without rushing into anything that felt like repetition of past mistakes. She kept her own apartment for 6 months after officially moving in, just so we both knew she was choosing to be there rather than settling for convenience. 2 years after moving back home, I proposed to Lisa in my dad's garden, using my grandmother's ring that my dad had saved for me. It felt right to start this new chapter in the place where my dad had taught me about love and commitment and taking care of the people who matter to you. The wedding was small, held in the backyard where my dad had hosted every family barbecue and birthday party of my childhood. His absence was still painful, but his presence was everywhere. In the oak tree he'd planted when I was born, in the flower beds he'd tended for 30 years, in the stories that everyone shared about him. Bill walked Lisa down the aisle, since both our fathers were gone. Mrs. Mitchell made the wedding cake using my dad's favorite recipe for chocolate frosting. The local pastor who'd conducted my dad's funeral service performed our ceremony, connecting the end of one chapter with the beginning of another. Heather sent a card congratulating us on our marriage. I handed it to Lisa without opening it, and she threw it away without asking what it said. 3 years after the wedding, we had our first child, a daughter we named Grace after my dad's mother. As I held her in the hospital room, I thought about the kind of father I wanted to be, the kind of values I wanted to pass on to her. I thought about my dad, who'd raised me to believe that family meant showing up for each other no matter what, who'd worked 2 jobs to give me opportunities he'd never had, who'd faced his own death with dignity while worrying about whether he'd prepared me well enough for life without him. He'd prepared me better than either of us had realized. The hardest year of my life had taught me lessons about resilience, integrity, and the difference between people who love you and people who use you. Last month, I got a call from Jennifer. Heather was filing for bankruptcy and trying to discharge the restitution she owed me as part of our divorce settlement. She'd apparently spent the last few years living beyond her means with a series of boyfriends, accumulating debt that she couldn't repay. Jennifer asked if I wanted to fight the bankruptcy discharge, which would require more legal fees and time. I thought about it for about 10 seconds before telling her to let it go. I didn't need Heather's money. I had my dad's house, a business I'd built with my own hands, a marriage based on actual trust and communication. Most importantly, I'd learned to stop letting her have any power over my emotional well-being. Some nights, when I'm rocking Grace to sleep in the nursery I built in what used to be my childhood bedroom, I tell her about her grandfather and the lessons he taught me, about the importance of showing up for people you love, about the difference between temporary problems and permanent values. I tell her that someday, people might try to take advantage of her kindness or use her pain against her. That trust is precious precisely because it can be broken, and that the goal isn't to never get hurt, but to never let hurt turn you into someone you wouldn't respect. Most importantly, I tell her that the people who truly love you will be there during your worst moments, not planning how to profit from them. And on quiet evenings when Lisa is working late and Grace is sleeping peacefully, I sit on my dad's porch and think about how proud he would be of the life I've built from the ashes of the worst thing that ever happened to me. Heather thought she was taking everything when she served me those divorce papers on the day I buried my father. Instead, she'd given me the chance to discover that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The inheritance she tried so hard to steal was never really about money. It was about the values, the character, and the love that my father had spent 32 years building in me. And that was something no divorce lawyer could ever touch.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop your favorite part in the comments. See you in the next one.